Hello, mental health enthusiasts. I'm Tony, and we are here for another episode of Ultimate Potential, a mental health podcast. My co host Craig is not here with us today, so I'm sad and lonely. But the good news is I have a really exciting guest, Christina Buttons, who is a investigative journalist. I'm so excited to spend some time with you, Christina. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Sure. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm an investigative reporter with Manhattan Institute. It's a public policy think tank. Became a journalist about 3 years ago. And uh, also, my opinions are my own, not my employer's.
So you are not you don't shy away from controversial topics, is what I'm learning about you. You've actually hit some really important issues that are kind of hotly debated head on in the media. And one of those has been the controversy and the negative press surrounding adolescent inpatient treatment. Really headed up by Paris Hilton and her. She had a negative experience in a youth treatment program when she was young. This would have been about, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago, maybe more. And she has since really kind of hit the airwaves and put a lot of work and effort into rallying some troops and trying to bring additional regulation around youth treatment and kind of alert the public to what she sees as a lot of problems and a lot of risk there. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got interested in covering this topic?
Yeah, my initial interest in this issue became came from my own personal experience because I attended three of the four treatment programs that Paris Hilton did when I was a teenager 20 years ago, which is several years after she went to them. Um, so around the time that Paris Hilton's documentary came out in 2020, I watched with interest because it was about her experience at Provo Canyon School. And, watching the documentary, I noticed some things that seemed off. For one, she hired a cartoonist to depict her getting punched in the face in front of other people, and I just thought that seems a bit extreme. I've never seen anything like that happen in a treatment setting before, where you have staff members just openly punching kids in the face in front of other people. It just seemed very strange to me. The way she depicted the observation room at Provo Canyon School, which I've never set foot inside of it, but I've walked past it plenty of times to know that, her portrayal of it was very far from reality. Things like that seemed a little strange to me. But I was open to her experience because, it was a tough program. It was very structured, very discipline oriented, but I was still very skeptical. And it was seeing, how residential treatment has been portrayed in the media that really inspired me to want to write about it. I think a lot of mainstream media sources have really distorted public perception about this complicated and nuanced issue, just sort of elevating an abuse narrative and really failing to sort of balance the perspective with what residential treatment is and who it serves, and that's why I felt like I didn't see anybody else reporting on it, and I figured it's going to have to be me.
Well,
That's it, and no one else is going to.
I'm so glad you did. So you went to three of four of the programs that Paris went to, and your experience perhaps was very different from what she claims her experience was. And it sounds like you
Hmm.
think that maybe some of her claims are a little outlandish or perhaps a little exaggerated, or there's some creative license taken.
I know for a fact that they are now. I've since interviewed many of the people who knew her back then.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, another story has unfolded,
Mm.
particularly that with what has to do with, the documentary maker of her film, wanted to create a hit documentary, and she sort of needed a kind of emotionally compelling trauma narrative to make it a successful documentary. And she brought information to Paris to influence her views and her memory, which she says is not very good.
Mm.
She acknowledges her memory is very bad of this time, but more broadly, the survivor movement programs 20, 30 years ago who have sort of started reframing their experience and reappraising their memories through a kind of trauma lens and this very expansive definition of what abuse is, where, consequences to their actions and disciplinary measures and anything that really made them uncomfortable, even chores that they didn't want to complete, those are now being sort of recategorized as abuse. And I saw this, it was 2005 when I got out of Provo Canyon School. I had been there for a year. It helped me for sure. I mean, it was a tough program, but it was totally necessary for me. But shortly after, Facebook comes out, and a lot of girls find each other on Facebook and form a group. And for a very long time, no one had ever mentioned anything about being abused in treatment. It was mostly just a place for people to reconnect and complain about our experiences. But it wasn't until the Paris Hilton documentary came out that some people started looking back and saying, you know what? It actually was abusive. And those are basically who is speaking out now and forming these groups like Breaking Code Silence and Unsilenced,
Okay.
based on that sort of expansive definition of what abuse is.
So, so then it's your opinion that Paris perhaps, took this narrative, and maybe there was some pressure behind the documentary, the filmmakers, that we need this to sell and we need this to be really persuasive and we need it to be sexy, and nothing sells like trauma, right? Trauma and violence, and so maybe some things were amplified. Um, And you also saw, in the advent of social media, people who maybe weren't claiming that they were abused kind of hopped on this narrative of like a victim narrative. Now, clearly, I think it's worth saying that just like in any church or any school or really any institution, there have been instances where people have been abused.
Right. And I would categorize those as completely separate. So we have
Okay.
like actual verified incidents of abuse, and then you have the survivor movement, which a lot of those cases, those are just the expansive definition of abuse.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that makes sense. I've never been one to really push back or challenge somebody's perception of whether or not they've been abused. But I do see what you're saying, and I do believe that, yeah, as the times have changed, there definitely is changing definitions, especially in people's minds, as to whether they were abused, right? So why does this matter? I mean, this flood of negative press that was really kind of initiated by Paris, and now, there's documentaries, Netflix documentaries, there's books. Why should people care about this?
Because anti-treatment activists, the so-called survivor movement, are actively targeting existing residential treatment programs, and they're not shy about this. They target them with negative reviews, they hold protests, they pressure regulators to shut programs down, because there's just been no pushback for 5 years. This narrative is allowed to take hold in people's minds, and they really believe that, youth residential treatment is just inherently or systemically abusive. And it doesn't help that, you have even like government agencies like the Senate Finance Committee putting out these reports that say that residential treatment is systemically abusive, even though the reports don't show evidence of that at all. They gather a bunch of anecdotes. They don't provide any data to contextualize the findings. And then they make these sweeping claims and generalize their findings across the entire treatment landscape.
Okay, so and one of the hallmarks of your reporting, and one thing that I really, there's many things I respect about you, but one of them is that you rely on data versus opinions and anecdotes. And you've done a extensive amount of research and looking into whether these abuse claims, whether it's systemically abusive, just inherently abusive across the board, whether or not, young people are getting better in these programs or getting worse. What is the data telling you?
The available data doesn't support the current panic over residential treatment. I mean, when we're talking about verified actual instances of abuse or neglect, these are pretty rare.
Mm-hmm.
But people have a tendency to, they read headlines when these things happen, and instead of looking at data, they just sort of begin to believe that there is just, rampant abuse going on. And this happens all the time with the media. I think people just, for example, like in 2020, after the death of George Floyd, if you were on social media, your timeline was like inundated with videos of Black men getting shot by police.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them were sort of deceptively shot and made it look like police are just out there killing Black men, and this contributed to a kind of panic that spurred calls for defund the police or even abolish the police. And people were saying that the police force was systemically racist. And when surveys were done, like a 2021 survey was done, they found that people, especially, people who were identified as very liberal, believed like thousands of unarmed Black men were killed by police in a single year, when the actual number was 12. They were looking at the data for 2019. So it just kind of goes to show, and no one would say that those 12 lives don't matter or that they weren't serious failures, but they just don't represent the norm in daily police interactions. They don't point to a panic that supports the movement to defund the police. Yeah. Or the fear that like Black men are just hunted by racist police officers. I compare the Survivor movement to defund the police. It's kind of the same effect that's happening right now.
And you, where I really was keyed on to you and your work is you wrote an article called "The Radical Movement to Divest from Youth Treatment." And it reads almost like a white paper in that it's very scholarly. It has a list of references and citations at the end that's many, many pages long. And it's filled with research essentially on this topic. And in it, you really say there's these kind of 5 narratives. Number 1, that abuse is systemic in residential treatment. It's all over the place. Number 2, that treatment programs don't work. Number 3, that treatment programs are unregulated. It's kind of like the Wild West and nobody's watching them. Number 4, that treatment programs are really run by just a bunch of people trying to get rich that are just profiteers taking advantage of desperate families. And finally, there's the opponents of youth residential treatment programs claim that really community-based interventions are all we need. Things that you can just find in your community. And that's literally the 5th kind of narrative that you challenge. And as you go through each of these 5 narratives, you really kind of deconstruct them and bring in all of this evidence that really challenges in a very compelling and convincing way that perhaps we're being manipulated as a nation by the media and by the press coverage on this topic. I actually want to make sure that we link this article to the show comments and the show notes, so anyone who hears this can go in and actually read, because it's one of those things where I get caught up. I get caught up in the media. It's hard not to, because it's very emotional. You watch something and it's like, oh, that happened one time.
That's what they're after. I mean, a lot of journalists today are just drama writers.
Yeah. I have a friend who said, if something happens once, then the media will say, well, this thing happened. If it happens twice, the media will say, this thing happens again and again. And then if it happens 3 times, the media will say, this thing happens time after time after time. Right? And you just convince a whole nation that there's a crisis or a problem where perhaps it isn't as widespread as what the media would suggest. And it really is about views and likes and clicks, and at the end of the day, money. Right?
It is. And this is why I became a journalist, because I saw the need for better reporting on a lot of topics, that we're really failing to inform people on important issues.
Yeah.
And I wanted them to have access to information that was missing from dominant media narratives.
Well, this is what really scares me, Christina, is, I'm a mental health professional. I've been working with youth and families for 25 years, and I am an owner-operator of a treatment program. And I see the miracles happen, every day and every week. And every week we have alumni students come back to us now in their 20s and 30s and 40s and say, this saved my life. Nothing else worked. And I was headed for an early grave, but this literally saved my life and preserved my family. And I'm functional and happy because of the work that was done in a youth treatment program. My concern is that families and parents swept up in this media tidal wave of negative press, which perhaps isn't accurate. It's not telling the full story. My concern is that they're getting scared off of getting help for their children. They're perhaps trying to use the community-based interventions that haven't worked and aren't working and won't work for their family. And perhaps we're losing some of those children. We're losing them to suicide. We're losing them to drug overdoses because their parents aren't getting the help that child needs because of this narrative that they're bought into.
Exactly. That's my fear as well, because I know firsthand how important this form of treatment is because of, my own experience and the upcoming reporting I have too. It looks at a lot of factors that have become very concerning, like legislation that was passed, well-intentioned kind of child welfare reforms and congregate care reforms. They were passed. Legislation was either, developed by Paris Hilton and her team or inspired by it, passed in 2021 that, severely restricted the types of restraints and seclusion that can be used, interventions that help manage kids with, really dangerous behavior. And now a lot of these kids get turned away. This was 2021. A number of states passed legislation that was either developed or inspired by Paris Hilton's, now close to 30-year-old story. And this legislation severely limited the types of interventions that can be used when a child is exhibiting, dangerous behavior that poses a threat to themselves or others, like physical restraint and seclusion. And this legislation was passed without consulting treatment providers, people who know what these kids are like and how to manage them.
Right.
And now we're seeing the consequences from passing this legislation. It's just really been having a devastating effect, because a lot of treatment programs now have to turn away high acuity youth and who would normally have been served, by residential treatment. Now they're being boarded in emergency rooms, they're ending up homeless or in juvenile detention, or, some of them may have even died because they can't get the help that they need.
Yeah, and that is happening. I mean, I personally know of 2 families that have lost their children, just of people in my sphere here. 2 families that have lost their kids because they were just too nervous to send their child to a treatment program. And clearly, we would have been able to help them and probably save that child's life. So if you take that and you take it across the entire nation, I mean, perhaps there's dozens or hundreds that we're losing in the effort to sell a few newspapers or get a few clicks, or, push this narrative that's sexy, that people are going to want to view on Netflix, but is actually resulting in real lives lost, which is very sad. So as you've gone out and you've really taken up the banner of saying, there's another side to this story. Youth treatment providers are getting the raw end of the deal here. They're being scapegoated. They're being railroaded. They're being painted with a very wide brush. Have you received any kind of pushback from these survivors or from the Paris Hilton's crew?
Yeah. I mean, I get that anytime I post, really. I mean, they all say the same kind of thing, as if they're just reading from a script. They have their own mythology, really, about the troubled teen industry. They say it's, this shadowy network of programs that operate under the guise of treatment, and they derive their practices from cults. They use deceptive marketing to trick parents into sending their mildly disobedient children away so they can profit off of abusing them. And obviously that's not true, but they're so committed to that narrative that, they'll tell me, oh, well, you're, probably just getting paid by the industry, or that I'm so traumatized by my experience in treatment and I haven't properly, processed the trauma, that I'm, now have Stockholm syndrome and I'm just defending my abusers.
Yeah.
Like, they just can't grasp that, maybe their narrative is wrong. And I feel for them, but, this is kind of what happens when you get a bunch of people together. They get stuck in this echo chamber and they think that their experience is the norm, when it really doesn't reflect, the vast majority of people who, I mean, there's been hundreds of thousands of people who have gone through these programs as teenagers. I mean, every year there's tens of thousands.
And the research bears out that it works.
Yeah,
there's tons of research on it.
A very vocal minority, whereas the silent majority, like, they moved on with their lives. They're not really that interested in defending their experience in treatment because, it's not fun. It's not summer camp. It's not enjoyable to go through a treatment program.
Right.
But somebody has to defend it, because this narrative is deeply, deeply damaging. And, I mean, we've already lost something like 60% of residential treatment programs since 2010.
Wow.
And that number is accelerating. Nearly every state has seen decline in its use.
So this is perhaps on its way to becoming a lost intervention or an extinct practice, which would be a shame, because it would be essentially like, taking heart surgery, something that saves hundreds or thousands of lives every year, and it just kind of going away, even though it's effective. And yes, there is some risk involved, but by and large is considered safe and and the state of the practice, right? So what would you like to see moving forward? What's the solution here?
Well, I'd like to see journalists do their jobs, first of all. I want legislators to do their jobs and consult with treatment providers before enacting sweeping reforms on issues they know nothing about. And I'd like to see, a cultural change that reflects the nuances of this issue better.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's always, of course, room for improvement. I don't think anyone would
Yeah.
argue that.
Yeah.
And there's debate about certain practices. It's an evolving field. That's all fine. I don't think people would argue with more oversight unless it, came at a significant cost, which it sometimes does.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there's oversight measures that are enacted that are just totally unnecessary. And then there's, the legislation that cripples residential treatment's ability to handle kids.
Yeah.
And that, I think, needs to be revisited.
Yeah.
And thankfully, Oregon, I think, is kind of leading the way on those reforms, and they've introduced legislation to roll back some of those restrictive measures that they placed on restraints and seclusions, because they recognize that it's having, devastating impact on the kids that they're supposed to serve.
Yeah, Oregon. So you're saying that Oregon really kind of charged out and said, "Hey, we need to rein in all of these bad programs,"
Mm-hmm.
and they really overcorrected, going too far, and now they're in the act of walking that back.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Some of the reforms back. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll just share with you my experience. As a treatment provider, I got into working with people, in my late teens, early 20s, because I love people and I have my own past and family trauma and my own story. And as is the case with a lot of, I think, therapists, I wanted to get involved and give back and help reduce suffering and increase joy in the world, right? Like some did for me when I was struggling. And so throughout my career, we ended up starting a treatment program, and it did very well. And at this point, we've been going now for 22 years. It's our 22nd year that we're in right now. We've never had an incident. We've never had a death. We've never had an incident of abuse or neglect. Really, it's just been kind of a beautiful career. I mean, I've watched literally now thousands of families go through a process that is special and safe and effective. I myself have been the one who's kind of headed up the research effort at our program. And we have a longitudinal study going back decades now with tens of thousands of data points that really empirically demonstrates that this is just something that works. It just flat out works. And so it's been sad for me to watch this media narrative. And it's something that it's hard for me to combat because, Paris Hilton has billions of dollars. She knows how to harness media. She has her own media company, actually. She has kind of unlimited resources she can throw at this. And then she has an army of very vocal, very angry people who want to see an entire industry taken down. And, what do you do with that? So I've always felt like I was maybe the hero of the story, right? I'm doing this good thing for society and I'm helping families. And there's young people who are out and walking around in the world that wouldn't be there were it not for the work I do. And the media narrative has really kind of, in some ways, convinced some of the people in the periphery of my life that, oh, you're not the hero, you're actually the villain. And it's actually a very painful thing to be able, to talk to somebody, and whereas 5 years ago they would have said, wow, that's amazing, you're doing great work, you're doing good things in the world, and now that person would say, wow, you're an abusive man, just profiting off of people's suffering. You're a manipulator. You're the villain of the story. That is a very painful thing, but it's something that we've all had to confront and live with. I've seen really great programs shut down because of false narratives. Like I said, I've seen families lose their children because of false narratives. And that's why I am extremely grateful for you and your work. It takes some moxie, it takes some courage to stand up and go against the tide and say, I'm going to stand for truth, whatever it may be. I'm going to find the data and I'm going to tell the story. And that's exactly what you're doing. So, question for you is, if you had somebody in your life come to you, a parent who's considering using a program, a youth program, and they're trying to save their child's life, they don't know what to do, everything else has failed, but they're terrified by the negative media, what would you tell them?
Well, I would say that the state of journalism right now is in shambles. I used to rely on mainstream media and consider myself pretty well-rounded on a number of topics, but I now have to kind of reevaluate everything I've learned because I found that a lot of journalists today are just really unreliable. And as a result, I try not to comment on issues that I'm not following extremely closely. I stick to the topics that I know really well. And I would suggest to learn how to become media savvy. And I think it's just unfortunate. A lot of journalists today are just drama writers. They're ignorant about a lot of the things they write about. They aren't interested in presenting a complete picture. And I would say ignore the survivor movement completely. I mean, these are just a bunch of adult women who have kind of succumbed to a moral panic. And I say moral panic because the women leading this movement, these are primarily privileged white women who represent, something like 5% or less of those who are served by residential treatment. And they're speaking on behalf of everybody else about their negative experience they had 20 to 30 years ago. And a lot of times programs that either don't exist anymore or their treatment model has evolved, because that's what, happens in medicine. We don't judge practices from 20 to 30 years ago. I mean, we don't judge today's practices and compare them with 20 to 30 years ago. Everything changes and evolves, and residential treatment remains a really important form of care. It serves a purpose and it has a place that no other type of care can really, you can't compare it. I mean, trying to replace it with home and community-based services is just nonsensical, because this is what exists for families who have exhausted all of those other options. It's the same thing for me. I mean, my parents were at their wits' end. There was a 9-month period I'd cycled through about 12 different types of short-term placements before I was placed at Provo Canyon School for a year. It's the only thing that can really work, because, you don't have, living at home is a privilege. And for those kids who aren't responding to anything else, you have to kind of earn your way back home. You're forced to have to change. You have to adapt your behavior. You have to learn how to manage your distress in an appropriate way so that you can return home. And residential treatment, any kind of long-term care setting like that, is unique. And there's really no replacement for it.
Well, that's powerful. You mentioned in there how industries evolve and services and practices evolve over time. And so many of these stories, I mean, almost all of these stories are stories of people talking about their experience 20 and 30 years ago. And like I said, I've been a treatment professional for almost 30 years now. And I've seen my practices evolve to become more effective. Back in the day, we didn't know what we didn't know. But it's really sad because, I mean, imagine that there was a movement to eradicate all automobiles nationwide or worldwide because of the evils and dangers of automobiles striking pedestrians when they're backing up. And they were basing that off of the automobiles of 20 years ago when none of us had backup cameras in our cars, right? No one did. And now every car you buy has a backup camera. And it's the same thing with youth residential treatment. We have so much now that we didn't have 30 years ago, yet the whole industry is being judged off of perhaps some of the one-off mistakes here and there that were made 30 years ago. And nobody's really taking the time to look at what we do now and how effective we are, and or taking the time to listen to, like you said, that silent majority of people out there who are saying, this was the only thing that worked for our family. This saved our life.
And unfortunately, that's sort of like a lot of op-eds have been submitted. People have tried to tell their side of the story, but they get rejected because it's not newsworthy when, a family says, I sent my kid to treatment and it worked exactly as it was intended and he got better. It's just not what they're after. I mean, a lot of news outlets today are no better than just gossip rags, and they're only interested in sensationalism. They don't fact check. They don't do anything to substantiate these stories, but they have this authority that's like really undeserved. And people think like, oh, there's no way that they would publish something without, ensuring that it was factual and true. And that's not the case at all. And it's one of the things I love about the outlet I write for, City Journal. They're so thorough and they're very knowledgeable about this topic because it overlaps with a lot of other issues that Manhattan Institute works on, like deinstitutionalization. But sometimes the fact-checking process takes like a week or more for a single article. And the report that I authored, I mean, that took over a month. They check every sentence and source. They check for clarification on everything. And I really love them for that. And I wish that was the standard for every media outlet, but it's just not.
Yeah. Well, maybe someday it will be. We can always hope, right? But in the meantime, we have responsible journalists like you out there doing good work and doing the hard work, right? Taking the long path of looking at data and double and triple checking sources and then really trying to tell an honest and balanced story. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate you as well. I know you do thankless work with a really challenging population. And I mean, I can't even imagine what that must feel like now to have, all of this hard work that you've done being looked at by the public. Like it's like you're the problem, but you're not.
Yeah. It's hard, but I think that everything is cyclic and everything comes back around, right? And I think that at some point, the world will learn to be more critical thinkers, and data and information, will be enthroned and valued once again, and we'll get there. Christina, I thank you so much for spending time with me today. Let me ask this, where should people go to find out more about your work or more about this topic? Do you have books or social media or websites you'd like to point people to?
My reporting can be found primarily at City Journal. That's Manhattan Institute's public policy outlet. It's city-journal.org. I recommend subscribing for the newsletter, and so you don't miss my reporting. I think I have an article coming out tomorrow about telos, actually, and the legislation that was passed in Utah. I'm pretty sure that comes out tomorrow. My social media is Buttons Lives. That's BUTTONSLIVES. I'm primarily on X and Instagram.
Thanks again so much. Is there anything you would like to share in closing as we wrap up?
I just appreciate you, and thanks so much for having me on. My
pleasure. Well, thank you so much, Christina, and thank you to our listeners who are there with us month in and month out. Please pass this podcast on to anybody who you think would benefit from it. And until next time, remember, mental health matters. Thanks for listening. Your mental health journey is so important to us. We'd love your help spreading the word so we can reach as many people as possible. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe here on our social media or wherever you access your podcasts. Thanks.